Greetings, greenhouse people. I'm your host, Bill Calkins, and because we like to provide this critical information in any way you choose to consume it, we will offer this discussion in video and podcast formats. My guest today is Josh Henry. You might know him from other videos like ornamental peppers, coleus, all sorts of different crops, but Josh is a technical specialist with Ball Seed, and today he's here to talk garden mum production as part of our Tech on Demand series covering key annuals and perennials commercially produced around the world. Of course, there are hundreds and hundreds of specific mum growing tips out there. They've been researched and studied and talked about for decades. We could do a 10-part series on the crop, and we probably have over the years with documents on specific diseases, podcast deep dives, long form videos, and more. But the goal this time is to address the most important tips and times when issues show up most. This is not going to be exhaustive, but rather hit on key strategies to get your team on the same page with the basics and common challenges faced year to year. It's a tough job, but I think Josh is up for the challenge. If you like this installment, be sure to subscribe to the Tech on Demand podcast on your favorite app and find hundreds of videos on the Ball Seed YouTube channel. But without further ado, Josh, let's see if you can cover garden mum production in less than 30 minutes.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Bill. I think we can do it.
All right.
So, what I want to start with really with mums, the key to success is really managing stress, right? Because with garden mums, we're growing them in the summer when things can be kind of crazy. A lot of times we're growing them outside, not in a controlled environment. And so that comes with a lot of added stress compared to a lot of our traditional greenhouse crops. Temperature highs and lows, lots of different pests and diseases, issues with nutrition. Think about all the rain or lack of rain that we can have out in the field, and issues with substrate moisture. So when you think about all these different stressors that we have to manage as growers, these are the things that are really key to keep in mind as we move through the crop cycle and think about how we can succeed with mums. So let's start at the beginning with our propagation checklist. When you get your mums, you're going to want to stick them immediately. But keep in mind that mums are fairly easy to root. If you want to make sure that you have good success, you can use a rooting hormone. You can use something like 1,000 to 1,500 parts per million of IBA as a dip, whether it's liquid or powder. And you can also come in after stick with a pretty low rate of about 100 to 200 parts per million KIBA as a spray. It's important to keep in mind that you want to get good coverage to make sure that rooting hormone is making its way down to the base of the stem where you want roots to form. However, again, mums root fairly quickly and fairly easily. You want to make sure that your mums are fully hydrated after about 24 hours after stick. And once you start your mist on day one, it should never be heavier than you have on day one. As you move from day one to day two and so on and so forth, you want to make sure that you dial back that mist over time so that you're not keeping them too wet. It's also really critical to make sure that you get a good bactericide or fungicide on the crop within about 48 hours of stick. There's a lot of different pathogens that can affect mums. Some of the main bacterial ones include Erwinia and Pectobacterium. And we also have things like botrytis that can cause a lot of damage very quickly. So one of the great things to keep in mind is using something like a copper-based fungicide that's effective both on our fungal pathogens as well as our bacterial pathogens. So coming in with a copper-based product like Phyton is going to be really effective. And then one of the other huge keys to success from the very start of propagation is to feed early and often. Mums grow very quickly, they root quickly, and they need a lot of feed. So even from that first week, you want to try and provide at least 100 parts per million nitrogen as a constant liquid feed, or if you're alternating, you can do 200 parts per million nitrogen at every other irrigation. You want to make sure that you're feeding really heavily throughout the propagation cycle. And you also really want to make sure that you feed heavily right before transplant. However, as we move through propagation, some of the different environmental considerations to keep in mind are to give them appropriate temperatures. And this can be kind of a challenge depending on where you're propagating, whether you're kind of in the northern US, southern US, and Canada. You want to make sure that your temperatures, your soil temperatures are in the 72 to 75 degree Fahrenheit range. Air temperatures typically range between 70 and 80, and you want to try and maintain those kind of temperatures throughout the entire propagation cycle. Definitely don't want them getting too hot as to stress out the plant, and generally you're not going to see much lower than that during those summer months that we're doing this kind of propagation. Managing photo period is also really important, right? Mums are a short day crop, so to keep them vegetative, we want to make sure that you are maintaining a good long day or providing night interruption. So 16-hour days or night interruption between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. is critical to make sure that you are maintaining the correct photo period. And then, as I said before, mums grow very quickly. They're very vigorous. So you want to stay on top of your PGRs to keep them nice and toned. So Diminizide is going to be a great tool, something like B9 or Dazide. You can apply them typically at 7 days after stick and 14 days after stick at about 1,000 to 2,500 parts per million. That's going to just help keep those plants nice and toned and keep them from stretching too much. One thing to keep in mind is if you are using Diminizide and you're also planning on using copper based fungicides, like I mentioned previously, keep in mind that those two do not play well together. So you definitely do not want to apply those two different products within about 7 days of each other. So if you get a copper based product applied right after stick, you want to try and give them a solid 7 days before you come in with your Diminizide, or else you might run into phytotoxicity issues. Whether you propagated the plants yourselves or you purchased in the liners, there's some things to keep in mind before transplant. You still want to maintain those long days, at least 14 and a half hours would be ideal. You want to try and keep those liners really well fed. Typically, you want to use a fairly balanced feed. Something like a 17-5-17 is going to be great. It's not too soft, and it's also going to give it all the phosphorus and other nutrients it needs to succeed. And you really want to limit your nutrient stress, because nutrient stress is one of the main reasons why you see crown budding or premature budding in your crop. So if you want to make sure that your plants don't flower until the end of the production cycle, making sure that you're keeping them well fed is essential. The other thing to prevent budding is to make sure that you don't have drought stress, right? So these types of stressors are really going to impact the quality of your crop. And one of the main ways they do that is by causing your crop to flower prematurely. So make sure that you're maintaining good moisture in the liner, not too wet, but you definitely don't want to let them dry out too much either. And then again, whether you brought these liners in or you propagated them yourself, you want to make sure that you get them planted as soon as possible. The longer they sit in the liner tray, the longer that they have to get stretched and to get root bound, and that's going to yield a lower quality plant down the line. So make sure you get them planted as soon as possible. Make sure that when you get them, whether you're receiving them or doing them yourself, you have all your hard goods in place. You have your pots, you have your substrate, you have your fertilizer, you have your drip lines. Make sure everything's in place so you can get them out and either in the greenhouse or in the field as soon as possible. And one last thing to keep in mind is that you also want to keep on top of those PGR applications to keep them nice and compact. If they do get a little out of hand, you can plant them deep. So that's one thing to keep in mind to make sure that you're not going to have a big floppy mum down the line. If they're getting too tall, you can plant them a little bit on the deep side just to make sure they're nice and steady. It's important at this point that we also talk about fertility, because one of the things that a lot of mum growers do is use controlled release fertilizers, and that's something that's not often used in the greenhouse, or not used as often. So as far as controlled release fertilizers are concerned, they offer a lot of different pros and cons that you need to consider. And one of the things that's really great about a controlled release fertilizer, especially for plants that is grown outside, is that they are always providing nutrition, right? When you're only using a water soluble fertilizer, the plant is only getting fertility when you make those fertigation events. However, with a controlled release fertilizer that's in your substrate, as long as there's moisture in that substrate, the controlled release fertilizer is going to be delivering a little bit of nutrition to the crop all the time. This is especially important if you have periods of high, heavy rain, right? Because a lot of growers will hesitate to come in and irrigate and fertigate with water soluble fertilizer when it's been raining day after day. And having that controlled release fertilizer there is just going to help ensure there's at least a little bit of fertility in the substrate at any given time. They are highly temperature dependent, which is both good and bad. When you have warmer temperatures, they're going to release more quickly. And unfortunately, with certain polymers, they tend to be run the risk of dumping when the temperature gets too high. So if you're growing in the south or you're having an especially warm summer, there are issues where the polymers can basically fail and release a certain percent of the nutrient all at once, which can cause your EC to spike and can burn your crop. So that is one of the watch outs for controlled release fertilizers, and why you need to make sure that you're getting a really good quality controlled release fertilizer that has less of a risk of dumping. And then the other issue to consider with controlled release fertilizers is that you don't necessarily have a lot of control once they've been applied, right? The two main methods that you can use to apply a controlled release fertilizer are to either incorporate it in the substrate before transplant. This is a lot easier for growers, but once it's in that substrate, it's in there. If for some reason you accidentally applied it too high, you can't really take it out. So that's kind of a limiting factor with those controlled release fertilizers. And then you can top dress, which technically speaking, you can come in and you can, remove it if you accidentally put it on at too high of a rate. But there's a lot of labor costs involved with applying a top dress. And you also run the risk of washout if you have those heavy rains that could wash the fertilizer out of the top of the pot. And you lost all that investment that you had in that controlled release fertilizer. So, what a lot of mum growers will choose to do, and what I see a lot of growers have success with, is use a combination of water soluble fertilizers and controlled release fertilizers. And by doing that, you're able to ensure that you have a nice low rate of controlled release fertilizer as a base to provide that baseline level of nutrition all the time. And then you can come in and either increase or decrease the amount of water soluble fertilizer as needed in response to temperatures, in response to rain events, basically just making sure that you have your nutrition dialed in, and it gives you a little bit more flexibility than relying on controlled release fertilizers on their own. So now that we've talked a little bit about controlled release fertilizers, let's talk about what we do at and after transplant. Once you've transplanted your mums, you want to begin your fertilizer program immediately. If you're doing that combination program where you're still using water soluble fertilizer, which I highly recommend, you want to start off by using a nice soft feed with high levels of phosphorus and high levels of ammonium that are going to help the plants to root out and develop a lot of great axillary shoots. Basically, you're building that foundation to the plant by giving it that nice soft fertilizer that it can use to take off and push through any kind of pre-plant or immediately post-plant stressors. Those soft feeds are going to encourage robust rooting. And along with all this root development, we also want to make sure that we're protecting the roots, because mums are susceptible to a lot of different root rots and other root issues. So you can use different biological products, things like Root Shield. Are able to help just keep those roots a little bit healthier. And then you can use traditional conventional chemistries, things like etradiazole and thiophanate methyl are going to be really great tools for controlling root rot diseases. And while something like Subdue Max is a great option for things like Pythium, generally speaking, we like to rely more on things like thiophanate methyl in the summer, because a lot of the different strains of things like Pythium that you'll find in the summer in the heat are more resistant to Subdue. So while Subdue is still effective, it's not necessarily our first line of defense as we typically would consider it in the greenhouse. So make sure that you're getting on these good products, have an effective rotation of different products to control those different root rot pathogens. And this is also a good time to establish graphical tracking. If that's not something that you've done, it can really help you just to dial in and make sure that your mums are getting to the right size at the right time, and that they're not getting too large and not getting too small. If you haven't done graphical tracking before, we do have a graphical tracking file that you can download from the Ball Seed website. I have the link here on the screen. So I highly recommend that you look into that to just make sure that your mums are meeting their targets in terms of height throughout the production cycle. As we move further into the production cycle, you want to make sure that you start establishing a good pH and EC monitoring program. You want to maintain fertilizer levels around 200 to 300 parts per million nitrogen, so fairly high. Mums are very heavy feeders. And you want to try and adjust your feeding rate and frequency to achieve about a 2.5 to 3.0 EC through the pour through method, or about a 0.75 to a 1 via the 1 to 2 dilution method. So again, we just want to make sure that we're giving them enough feed to establish and get a nice bulky plant. This is a good time to also ramp up your IPM measures. So if you're in the greenhouse, it's going to give you a little bit more options in terms of control. It's a lot easier to have a biological program in the greenhouse or in a hoop house compared to out in the field. So that's something that you can consider as well. If you're in the field, you're going to have to rely more on your traditional chemistries. Something like mainspring is a huge option that I see a lot of growers using nowadays. It can be applied as a drench. It's effective on a very wide range of different pests, and it has a really long lasting residual. So that's one that I've heard a lot of growers have success with in recent years. And then you also want to, again, going back to the feed program, make sure that you're giving enough fertilizer to get that nice, robust branching, to get a nice shaped plant down the road. You got to build that strong base first. And then you also need to assess whether or not you need to do a pinch. With modern genetics, that's getting less and less common. However, it's still something that some growers will do. So this is kind of the time and place where you determine whether or not you need to do a pinch. As we continue to bulk up our plants and start getting closer and closer to short days, this is where you need to start assessing your potential for PGRs. So, typically speaking, and this is true not just for mums, but for most crops, you're going to have more success by using lower rates and earlier applications and just kind of tapping the brakes over the course of the production cycle rather than waiting for them to get too big, being like, oh no, I need to get a PGR on as soon as possible, hitting them with a high rate and then accidentally stopping them. That is not what you want to do. So just kind of hit the brakes a little bit over the entire course of the production cycle. Using those graphical tracking apps that I mentioned earlier is a great way to check and make sure that they're where they need to be. Then you also need to consider if for some reason your crops are behind, you might need to come in and use some GA to help get a little bit more internode elongation. This is also the right time to get in supports. I know this kind of varies depending on what region you're in, but you can use things like mum netting or cages just to help provide a little extra support to the canopy. And this is also the point at which you're going to want to switch from your, more soft feed, your 20-10-20s, to something more like a Cal Mag feed that's going to be a lot higher in nitrate, nitrogen, lower in phosphorus, and also providing those resources like calcium and magnesium that are kind of lacking in something like a 20-10-20. Once your plants are up to about 2/3 to 3/4 of the desired size, that's where you want to switch to your Cal Mag feed. As you move into short days into finish, you want to focus on toning your crop. You want to avoid using ammonium nitrogen later in the cycle by switching to that kind of CalMag feed. And a lot of growers also have success by providing clear water irrigations to kind of flush those excess fertilizer salts. Uh, depending on what you want to do, some growers still provide low levels of nutrients. Some growers pick a point where they go completely clear water. It kind of depends on how well you've loaded the crop early on as to what method you want to go with. But either way, you're going to want to start pulling back on nutrition to tone that crop out. And you also want to try and do everything you can to curb your late season disease pressure. Things like fusarium can be a major issue, botrytis. A lot of our fungal pathogens can be a huge issue as that canopy gets nice and dense. So when you're doing your fungicide sprays, make sure you get good canopy coverage to make sure that fungicide gets deep into the canopy and is effective against your different fungal pathogens. You also want to make sure that you start spacing the mums if you haven't done so already and increase the airflow between those mums to help keep the canopy nice and dry and reduce the risk of fungal pathogens moving in. You also want to, at this point, apply any final PGRs, something like paclobutrazol or bonsai at about 1/2 part to 2 parts per million as a drench is going to be great to stop or hold the crop depending on how large the crop has gotten at this point. Now let's just talk about some of the common physiological disorders. Low EC is a very common disorder that we see where the plants is stunted, very bright yellow, and you also see crown budding occur. Again, so when you have that nutrient stress, plants will start to flower prematurely. Crown budding is often a result of multiple different stressors, but nutrition is one of the key stressors that leads to this. Also, things like cool nights can also lead to premature budding. Drought can also cause this. If you start seeing premature budding in your crop, you can use something like Ethifon or Florel. It is an option. However, you have to consider that Ethifon is a stress enhancer. So if you've got stress, ethifon is going to make that stress a little bit worse. You might see some leaf yellowing or leaf loss. And the other thing to consider is that it may inhibit or delay your flowering. So you want to make sure that you're not applying it too late into the production cycle, or you may risk not meeting your target in terms of flowering. Reproductive phosphorus deficiency or a late season phosphorus deficiency can also occur if you didn't preload with enough phosphorus early in the season and you switch to a low or no phosphorus fertilizer and then start switching to clear water toward the end of production. Phosphorus will leach very rapidly from the substrate, and especially if you've had a lot of heavy rains in the summer, you may see lower leaf yellowing, upper leaf purpling, like you see on this plant here. And what you need to do is come in and try and provide sufficient levels of phosphorus to ensure that you don't have this kind of purpling occur. Purpling can also be made worse if you have low night temperatures. So if it's getting too cold at night, that can also make purpling a little bit worse. So keep those kind of things in mind. High pH is another common physiological disorder. So basically, the optimal pH range for mums is going to be about 5.5 to 6.2. And if you start getting too high of a pH, you have low availability of micronutrients, specifically iron and manganese. And if you have low availability of those nutrients, you'll start to see upper leaf interveinal yellowing, like you see here in this photo. So, as far as corrective procedures are concerned, you can come in with a more acidic fertilizer, something that's higher in ammonium nitrogen. So, that would be something like 20-10-20, that's higher in ammonium and lower in nitrate compared to something that has more nitrate, like a 15-5-15. So switch to a more ammonium based fertilizer. You can come in with an iron application as a spray or a drench. Typically, I would recommend using an iron chelate at about 5 ounces per 100 gallons, or whatever the label rate is for the specific product you're using. You can also use iron sulfate, which will lower the pH and provide iron. However, iron sulfate's not as available as iron chelate, so I would definitely recommend going for the chelate if possible. You can also use an acid water drench using sulfuric acid to irrigate. You want to hit a target of about 4 to 4.5 for the actual irrigation water. However, this does run some risk of accidentally burning the crop, and you have to remember to rinse the foliage after application to prevent any kind of phytotoxicity issues. Low pH is not super common in mums, but if you get a pH lower than the 5.5 range, you start seeing a hyperaccumulation of micronutrients, again, iron and manganese. And that can be a little bit of an issue, causing lower leaf kind of purpling, black spotting. And to correct that, you need to switch from an acidic fertilizer like 20-10-20 to something that's higher in nitrate, something like 15-5-15. You can also make a flowable lime drench, something like Calox pH, typically at a rate of about 1 to 2 quarts per 100 gallons. And then you also want to make sure that you're checking the roots, because when you start getting that low pH, that can cause some root damage. So make sure that you're maintaining good moisture management, and you can provide a fungicide drench if necessary to help protect the roots. As far as diseases are concerned, got a lot of root zone diseases, things like Pythium, Phytophthora, and Fusarium. These are all, they can be huge problems in mums, especially when you've got those summer extremes. When you've got periods of really high rain, you need to make sure that you come in and provide a nice fungicide drench to help protect that root system after all that heavy rain. Botrytis or gray mold can also be an issue. Again, you got to make sure that you're getting good canopy penetration with your sprays to make sure that you're controlling these types of fungal pathogens. Typically, you want to rotate with different modes of action. At least 3 different modes of action is typically recommended. However, a lot of our 7 and 11 products are going to be really effective for controlling botrytis and other pathogens like that. Products like Mural or Broadform, Pageant, those are all going to be great options for you. You also want to maximize your airflow as much as possible and rely on drip irrigation if possible to keep the canopy nice and dry. Also, your bacterial leaf spots can pop up at any time during production. Lean on those copper-based products, things like Phyton or Postiva. Those are going to be your best bets to help control bacterial leaf spots. For pests, it's important to make sure that you are scouting regularly. If you're growing big fields, it's easy to overlook the back 40 of mums that you have. So make sure you're out there walking the crops constantly. Use your sticky cards, look for those pests. And if you see pest populations starting to pop up, you need to control them as soon as possible. Thrips are going to be one of the biggest pests for mums, so keep a good preventative program from the start. As I mentioned earlier, mainspring is a great tool with very long residual. There's some other products like Conserve and Azotin that are great options. So keep on those different conventional insecticides. And you can also rely on things like nematodes to help control the thrips as they are in the soil. So utilize those resources as well. Spider mites can become a big issue, especially when the forecast is hot and dry. They like that hot and dry weather. So if you see them popping up, it's important just to rogue out the really bad plants because they can be very hard to control. So rogue them out, get them out of the greenhouse, remove them and destroy them as soon as possible, and maintain a really aggressive rotation if you are seeing spider mites in your crop. There's a lot of great miticides that are able to be used on mums. So things like Avid, Hexagon, Sultan, Contos being one of our only drenchable options that we have here. These are great options to help control spider mites. And then loopers, caterpillars, cabbage moths, these also can be a big issue later in the season. And so typically you can get away with just reactive management. However, again, it's important to keep on top of it by scouting frequently. Bacillus thuringiensis, or BT, and Conserve are some of the main lines of defense. Mainspring also controls these types of caterpillars, so if you've made a drench application earlier in the season, that'll be effective against these as well. So for some of our take-home messages, it's really, really key to minimize your environmental or cultural stressors as much as possible. Mums are heavy feeders. Feed them early, feed them often. Make sure that you're not getting a lot of drought. It can be hard out in the field, but make sure that you're not keeping them too wet, but you're also not letting them dry down too hard. And if you're having unseasonably cold temperatures, do what you can to affect that. If they are growing in a hoop house, close up the walls, close up the house to kind of retain that heat, and that'll help make sure that you're not getting any delays from those cool temperatures. You want to start by building good plant architecture with plenty of phosphorus, plenty of ammonium. Give them the feed that they need early on, and then you can provide additional encouragement with things like GA only if absolutely necessary. As you're moving toward the end of the crop cycle, you want to change your fertilizer from your soft feed to more of a harder CalMag high nitrate feed, and then leach toward the end. And that's going to give you the most success with your crop. And with that, I'll hand it back over to you, Bill.
I'm impressed. That was under 30 minutes. You just went through just about everything growers need to know to build their strategies for a successful mum program. Like you said, you got to manage the stress, which is extremely hard in the time of year that growers are producing mums, and they're susceptible to diseases and pests. It's really it's always seems like a tough crop, but it can be done. It can be done, and it can be done really well. I mean, we see millions of beautiful mums out in the marketplace every single fall, so we know it can be done. It just takes a lot of attention, and really it comes down to managing that stress, because I would imagine that'll help avoid some of these problems. Thank you so much, Josh. I will put links to a lot of the resources that Josh mentioned, including the pour through tests, the graphical tracking. We've done shorts on the purpling of foliage. We've got podcasts, like a 3-part series, and then we have specific videos on how to push or hold your mums, depending on how things are playing out at the end of your production season. In addition to that, you can find hundreds of tech on demand educational resources online. Every week, I send a newsletter covering a range of cultural and technical topics. We've got videos, we've got podcasts, and the Greenhouse Tech Team on Facebook is a great place to connect with a global network of more than 6,000 of your peers to ask questions about mums, show your crops, look for resources. And I suggest you join that Facebook group. Just search Greenhouse Tech Team, answer a couple simple questions, and I'll let you right in. But Josh, once again, good work on covering mums in a very concise but power-packed presentation. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Bill.
And I'm Bill Calkins on behalf of our entire Tech on Demand team. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Take care out there, and good luck with those mums.